When two officers arrested her, they had no idea they would face her again, this time in court as the judge who would decide her fate. It was a sunny afternoon in Fort Collins, Colorado. The park was alive with the sound of children playing, joggers moving steadily along the path, and families picnicking under the shade of tall oak trees. In the middle of this bustling but peaceful scene, a black woman sat Ada on a bench near the pond. A thick hardcover book rested on her lap. Her name was Camila, respected attorney, taking advantage of a rare moment to escape her demanding schedule. She was immersed in her reading when a loud screeching of tires broke her concentration. A patrol car pulled up to the curb, drawing the attention of a few curious onlookers. Two officers got out of the vehicle. Their stern expressions radiated authority, their eyes immediately fixed on Camille, the only person sitting alone around. "Ma'am, can we talk to you for a moment?" called one of the officers, his voice laden with an air of suspicion rather than concern. Camille looked up from her book. Her calm demeanor remained unwavering. "Of course," she answered, closing the book carefully. The second officer stepped closer, his tone curt. "We got a call about suspicious activity in the area. Could you tell us what you're doing here?" Camille raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "Suspicious activity? I'm just sitting here reading." She picked up the book as if to prove her point, but her scrutiny didn't lessen. "We can see an ID." The first officer demanded. Her pulse quickened, but she remained composed. "I don't understand. What's the reason for this?" "It's routine," the second officer said, though his tone implied otherwise. The small crowd that had gathered began to murmur. Some seemed curious while others exchanged awkward glances. Sensing the imbalance in the interaction, Camille sighed and pulled her wallet from her purse, handing over her driver's license. One of the officers took it, examining the information with unnecessary intensity. Camille Johnson read aloud almost mockingly, "What are you doing here, Miss Johnson?" Camille inhaled deeply, trying to remain patient. "I'm alive in this city. I came to the park to enjoy myself." "That's a problem." The officer's lips pressed together. "We'll see." He handed her back the ID, but instead of walking away they continued. Ron, standing there asking questions that seemed less routine and more like an interrogation. "Always carries a book like that?" one of the officers scoffed. "Are you alone here or waiting for someone?" the other added, his hand resting on his belt in a deliberate and unmistakable gesture. Camille had handled countless tense situations in court, but this was different. The power dynamic was evident and their tone carried an edge she instantly recognized, yet she chose her words carefully. "I will not answer any more questions unless you tell me what I am accused of," she said firmly. Her refusal seemed to trigger something in them. The first officer stepped forward. "Don't join us," she snapped. "We're just doing our job and I know the law." Camille replied, his voice firm. "I'm not breaking any by sitting in a public park." But the reason was not on his agenda. The first officer grabbed her arm. "She is resisting," she said, though Camille had not moved. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, surprised. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. A man pulled out his phone to record the scene. "Stop resisting," he repeated, the officer louder this time as if performing for the growing crowd. Camille's heart raced as she felt the cold metal of the handcuffs locking around her wrists. She tried to stay calm, although humiliation and frustration burned in her chest. The officers led her to their patrol car, ignoring the questions of the curious. Camille turned her head towards the crowd, locking eyes with a young woman holding her phone up. For a moment there was an unspoken shift, a silent plea to document the injustice unfolding, but as the car door slammed shut, Camille knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Inside the cramped back seat of the patrol car, Camille's mind was racing. She had spent years defending clients, fighting for justice and navigating the legal system, but now she was on the other side of it. The absurdity of the situation hit her, but there was no humor in it, only anger. The ride to the station was stifling, save for the crackle of the police radio. Camille looked out the window, her reflection merging with the landscape as she passed. Her wrists ached from the handcuffs digging into her skin. At the station things only got worse. The booking process was invasive, humiliating, and designed to strip her of her dignity. They took her fingerprints, took her picture, and she was led to a small cell lit with fluorescent lights that buzzed incessantly. "Enjoy your stay," one of the officers said with a smug grin as he closed the cell door. Camille sat down on the cold bench, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She relived the events in the park over and over in her mind, how she had gone from such a peaceful time to this. The answer was as clear as it was bitter. Prejudice. Hours passed before anyone recognized her again. A young officer approached the cell with a clipboard in hand. "Miss Johnson, you have been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer," she said in a flat tone. "What are you basing this on?" Camille asked, her voice higher than she intended. "You can argue that in court," he replied before turning around. Camille exhaled slowly, forcing herself to think strategically. The charges were weak and she knew it, but she also knew the battle ahead of her would not be easy. Cases like hers rarely were. Eventually Camille was released on bail. As she left the station, the air, the cool of the night, hit her like a wave, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. She saw her colleague and friend Marissa waiting for her by the sidewalk. Marissa ran to her, her face a mix of relief and concern. "You're okay?" Camila felt, although her body betrayed her with a slight tremor. "I'm okay," she said, although the words sounded empty. As they drove, Marissa kept looking at her out of the corner of her eye, waiting for her to speak. Finally Camille broke the silence. "I'm not going to leave this like this, Marissa, not this time." Marissa's grip on the wheel tightened. "What are you thinking?" I'm thinking I'm tired of this happening," Camille replied. "I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to fight, and I will do it. That night Camille sat at her kitchen table surrounded by blogs of notes and open books. She worked tirelessly outlining a civil rights lawsuit against the officers and the department. Her hands shook not from fear but from a latent determination. As the days turned into weeks, the community began to rally around her. The video of her arrest shared by the young woman in the park became viral. People from all walks of life reached out with messages of support, sharing their own stories of injustice. Camille's resolve grew stronger with every email, every phone call, every comment. She wasn't fighting just for herself, she was fighting for all those who had been silenced, humiliated, or ignored. But even as she prepared for the court battle, she couldn't foresee the moment when justice would take an unexpected turn. The weeks following Camille's arrest were a whirlwind of emotions and relentless work. Her law firm was initially hesitant, worried that her public case might overshadow her carefully cultivated reputation, but Camille didn't waver. She calmly but firmly explained that this fight wasn't just about her, it was about setting a precedent. The viral video had done more than spread her story, it had sparked conversations across the city and beyond. The images of Camille, calm but defiant as officers forcibly led her away, became a symbol of resistance in the face of injustice. Reporters began calling, asking for interviews, but Camille turned them all down. She wasn't interested in media attention. Her focus was clear, like a laser, building a case that would not only hold the officers accountable but also expose the systemic failures that allowed such behavior to persist. Yet at night, when the world fell silent, the weight of the situation took its toll. She relived the arrest in her mind, the dismissive tone, the handcuffs, the murmurs of the crowd. She thought about how easily things could have escalated further. The thought turned her stomach but also fueled her resolve. One night as she reviewed her research, Marissa stopped by her house with takeout. Camille barely looked up from her laptop when Marissa placed the food on the table. "You've been at this for hours," Marissa said softly. "I have no choice," Camille replied without missing a beat. Marissa sat across from her, studying her face. "You know this is bigger than just a legal battle, right? People are looking at you now." Camille closed her laptop, finally meeting her friend's gaze. "I know," she said, her voice firm. "That's why I can't afford to lose." Her preparation, she was meticulous. She reviewed similar cases, looking for precedents and gathering evidence to dismantle the officer's claims. He enlisted the help of trusted colleagues by forming a legal team that shared his passion for justice. But it wasn't just about the court, it was also about She made sure to get involved with the community, attended public meetings, listened to others who had experienced similar injustices, and even gave a talk at a local college about the importance of accountability. One afternoon, as she was walking to her car after a meeting, a stranger approached her. "Miss Johnson," asked the woman excitedly, "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her voice breaking from standing up to them, "fighting for all of us." Camille felt a lump in her throat. She managed a small smile. "I'm just doing what I can." The support of the community was a double-edged sword. It made her stronger, but it also increased the pressure. She couldn't let them down. Then one day, her lawyer called with news that the officers she was suing had filed a motion to dismiss the case. Camille was expecting it. It was a standard move to delay the process. But as her lawyer explained the next steps, she froze. Camille said cautiously, "You should know something else. You've been assigned as a judge for one of their cases next month." The irony was overwhelming. Camille sat back in her chair, processing the revelation. She had spent weeks preparing to face those officers in court, and now fate had given her a completely different form of justice. For a moment she wondered if she would be able to do it, if she could sit on that stand and remain impartial. But then she thought of everything she had been put through by the people who depended on her to take a stand. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a chance to show what true justice looked like. The courtroom was filled with hushed murmurs as people filed in and took their seats. The case wasn't particularly high profile, an internal misconduct hearing involving 2 officers accused of excessive force in an unrelated incident. For most it was just another day in the court system. The 2 officers, Carter and Daniels, were sitting at the defendant's table wearing their suits of armor. They leaned towards each other, talking in low voices, their expressions indifferent, almost bored. To them this was routine, another hurdle to overcome, another case they would leave behind. Then the door to the judge's chambers opened and the room fell silent. Camille stepped out onto the stand, her black robes billowing behind her. She walked with purpose, her expression calm but authoritative. As she took her seat, she glanced at the defendants. The reaction was immediate. Officer Carter's face lost all color, his eyes opened wide in surprise. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, clenching his jaw as he struggled to process what he was seeing. It was her, the woman they had humiliated and arrested in the park. Camille paused briefly, letting the weight of the moment settle in the room. Then with a clear and firm voice she began the session. "This court is now in session. Please take your seats." The officers sat stiffly, their composure crumbling. Carter whispered something to her attorney, who nodded but kept his focus on Camille. For the first time in weeks Camille felt she had the upper hand, but knew this was not about revenge. Her job as a judge required impartiality and she would maintain that standard, yet the irony was not lost on her or anyone else in the room as the attorneys presented their opening arguments. Camille maintained her professionalism, listening intently and taking notes, but every now and then her gaze would drift to the officers. She could see the tension in their shoulders, the way her hands moved slightly restlessly during a break. Carter and Daniel stood in the hallway talking quietly but agitated. "How is it she's the judge?" "Yes, I know, Carter." Her frustration barely contained. "This has to be a setup," Daniels muttered, shaking her head. "It's not a setup," her attorney interrupted. "It's a coincidence, and they need to stay focused. She's not the enemy here, her actions are." But the officers weren't listening. They were too consumed by the surrealness of their situation. When court resumed, Camille remained composed, making sure the hearing proceeded fairly and efficiently. However, her mere presence seemed to unsettle the defendants. Every time she addressed them, they shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their confidence slowly crumbling. At one point during a witness testimony, Camille noticed Carter glancing at her. His expression wasn't one of defiance, it was something closer to regret, as if he was beginning to understand the gravity of what they had done. At the end of the day, the tension in the room was palpable. Camille stood up the session, banging her gavel hard. "We will meet again tomorrow at 9 a.m. she announced as the room emptied. Camille stayed on the dais organizing her notes. She could feel the weight of the glances of the officers who hesitated near the door, clearly debating whether to approach her. In the end they did not. They left silently, their steps heavy with the realization that this was far from over. But for Camille, the real challenge was not in the irony of the moment, but in the decisions that would come next and whether justice could truly prevail. The courtroom was packed. The next morning the news of the unexpected turn had spread, drawing a larger than usual crowd for a misconduct hearing. Some were there out of curiosity, others to support Camille, although they knew her role as a judge prevented her from showing favoritism. Camille entered with the same calm and composure, her robes billowing as she took the stand. The attorneys wasted no time and began to present their cases. The prosecutor methodically presented evidence against the officers, including testimony from the victim of the excessive force incident. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "the officers' actions were not just an error in judgment, they were a flagrant abuse of power. Their behavior reflects a pattern of disregard for the very people they swore to protect." Camille nodded, absorbing every word, her pen sliding across her notepad. Her focus was unwavering even as the defendants shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. The defense attorney rose to respond, his tone measured but tense. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the incident in question, we argue that the situation escalated due to factors beyond the officers' control. Their intent was not malicious, and we believe this case lacks sufficient grounds for punitive measures." As the arguments continued, Camille could not ignore the parallels between this case and her own experience, the excuses, the justifications. It was all too familiar. However, she put her personal feelings aside, determined to let the facts guide her judgment. When it came time for witness questioning, the tension in the courtroom intensified. The prosecutor called the victim to the stand, a young man named Ian. His voice trembled as he recounted the night the officers wrestled him to the ground during a routine traffic stop. "They didn't even give me a chance to explain," Ian said, his eyes fidgeting between the attorneys and officers. "It felt like they had already decided I was guilty before I even opened my mouth." The prosecutor pressed harder. "And you resisted their orders at some point?" "You didn't respond." Ian was firm. "You were scared, but I did everything I was told. It didn't matter. They had already made their decision." The room fell silent as the defense attorney stood up for cross-examination. He tried to find flaws in Ethan's testimony, but the young man stood his ground. Camille watched intently. His expression was inscrutable. Then the moment came that everyone was waiting for. The defendants were called to testify. Officer Carter was the first to take the stand. He looked nervously at Camille as she swore to tell the truth, her voice shaking as she answered the prosecutor's questions. "Officer Carter," began the prosecutor, "you are accused of using excessive force in this incident. Can you explain your actions that night?" Carter hesitated, his gaze shifted to Daniels before answering. I thought the situation was escalating. I made a decision in the moment." "And do you believe your actions were justified?" Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat at that moment. "Yes, but looking back, could have handled it differently." The prosecutor insisted. "How would he have handled it differently?" "Not by tackling an unarmed and compliant person to the ground." Carter opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence said more than any explanation. When it was Daniel's turn to testify, his demeanor was equally tense. His attempts to justify his actions only strengthened the prosecutor's case, highlighting the officer's inability to take responsibility. Camille listened intently. His face showed no emotion, but inside he felt a mix of frustration and pity. These men had been given authority, but they used it recklessly, leaving a trail of damage in their wake. As the day progressed, it became clear that the evidence against the officers was overwhelming. The prosecutor's closing argument was powerful, urging the court to set a precedent that abuse of power would not be tolerated. When the defense presented its closing statement, it was clear they were desperately searching for arguments. Their words lacked conviction and Even the officers looked like the likely outcome. Camille adjourned the session, his voice firm as he announced that the ruling would be given next week. Next, as the room emptied, Carter and Daniel stood near the exit, their pale, tense faces for the first time seeming to understand the gravity of their actions and the reality of what awaited them. But justice isn't just about punishment, it's about accountability, change, and ensuring that the mistakes of the past aren't repeated. A week later, the courtroom was silent as Camille walked in to deliver her ruling. Every seat was filled, the tension almost palpable. Reporters filled the back of the room, ready to capture every word. This was no longer just a case about two officers, it had become a symbol of a larger fight for justice and accountability. Camille's voice was calm but firm as she began. The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve the community with integrity, respect, and fairness. When those entrusted with this responsibility abuse their power, they erode public trust and cause harm that goes far beyond the immediate victim. This case has exposed the consequences of such actions. She paused, her eyes scanning the courtroom. Carter and Daniel sat at the defense table with their heads bowed. The weight of their words was unmistakable. The evidence presented has shown that officers Carter and Daniels acted with unnecessary force, ignoring the protocols they swore to uphold. Their actions were not only unjustified but indicative of a troubling pattern that must be addressed. Camille outlined the consequences: mandatory suspension without pay, participation in extensive retraining programs, and a formal disciplinary record that would accompany them. The ruling was firm but fair, balancing accountability with the opportunity to reform. As she finished, Camille closed the case with a decisive blow of the gavel. The meeting adjourned. The officers stood there, expressions grim as they prepared to leave. Before leaving, Carter hesitated and turned to Camille. "Your Honor," he began, his voice barely audible. "Sorry, it was not enough to undo the damage, but it was a start." Camille nodded, acknowledging her words without offering absolution. True change, he knew, would come with actions, not apologies. As the courtroom emptied, Camille sat, taking a moment to reflect. She had seen justice done, but the victory was bittersweet. For each case like this, countless others went unreported, unsolved. That night, Camille attended a community meeting at a local recreation center. The room was filled with people eager to share their stories, frustrations, and hopes. Listening, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. An older woman approached her after the meeting, her voice shaking with emotion. "Thank you," she said, squeezing Camille's hand tightly. "What you did in that courtroom means the world to us." Camille smiled softly. "This is just the beginning. We have so much more work to do." The following week saw meaningful conversations between community leaders, law enforcement, and local activists. Camille used her platform to advocate for reforms, emphasizing the need for transparency and accountability in policing. The case had created a ripple effect not only in Fort Collins but across the state. People began demanding change, pushing for policies that prioritized fairness and equality. For Camille, the journey was not about personal vindication, it was about ensuring others did not have to endure what she had faced. The fight for justice was ongoing, but moments like this reminded her that change, though slow, was possible. One afternoon, as she stood on the courthouse steps watching a group of young activists gathered for a peaceful demonstration, felt a sense of hope. The system wasn't perfect, but with enough voices it could move towards progress, and that she thought was the kind of justice worth fighting for. If you believe in the power of accountability and change, subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire action and reflection. Let's work together to make the world a more just place.